She didn't scream when her uncle's hand closed around her wrist and dragged her through the doors of the Mudhen Saloon. She didn't cry when he shoved her forward into the smoke and the stink and the laughter of drunk men who looked at her like she was livestock at auction. Lena Carter just stood there, hands folded, eyes down, breathing slow, because she had learned in the hardest way a woman can learn anything, that silence was the only armor she had left. And then a pouch of raw gold hit the bar so hard the bottles rattled. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow every part of Lena and Cole's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Mudhen Saloon sat at the belly of Bitter Creek like a bad tooth nobody had the nerve to pull. It had been built in the early days of the mining rush when men flooded into the Montana mountains with pickaxes and dreams and very little else. And it had survived every hard winter and every claim dispute and every gunfight that the town had thrown at it, not because it was well built, but because men always needed somewhere to go when the cold got into their bones and the loneliness got into their heads. The floors were warped. The bar was a plank of pine laid across 2 whiskey barrels. The lamp smoke hung so thick in the rafters that newcomers sometimes ducked under it like it was a physical thing. On the night that would split Lena Carter's life clean in two, every stool and table was taken. She heard the noise before she could see anything clearly. The shouting, the scraping of chairs, the wet laughter of men who had been drinking since noon. Her uncle Hiram had one hand clamped around her upper arm, and he walked fast the way he always did when he owed something to someone, which was most of the time. Lena kept pace because she had no choice. She kept her eyes low because it cost her less that way. "Move it," Hiram muttered, not to the crowd, but to her. She moved. The saloon swallowed them whole. Heads turned. That was the first thing she noticed, the way conversation dropped in patches as they came through the door, the way men's eyes found her and stayed. She was used to being looked at in Bitter Creek. Not with admiration. With the particular flatness of men who see something and are already calculating what it's worth. Hiram Reed was 43 years old, thick through the shoulders with a beard he never trimmed and eyes that moved too fast when he was nervous. He owed money to 6 different men in this town, and the particular man he owed the most to a card player named Dutch Farrow, who operated a table in the back corner of the Mudhen every night of the week, had stopped being patient approximately 2 weeks ago. Lena had known something was coming. She had felt it in the way Hiram watched her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. In the way he stopped yelling at her and started being quiet instead, which was always worse. Quiet men with debts were the most dangerous kind. She just hadn't known it would be tonight. Dutch Farrow was already standing when they reached the back of the room. He was lean, silver-haired, with a gambler's stillness, and a gambler's eyes always reading, always adding up. He had 2 men flanking him who didn't sit down and didn't smile. "Hiram," Dutch said, "you're 2 weeks late." "I know it." Hiram's hand tightened on Lena's arm. "But I got something that covers what I owe. More than covers it." Dutch's eyes moved to Lena. They traveled over her the way a buyer inspects a horse. Slowly, thoroughly, without a single flicker of anything she could call human. "That's so," Dutch said. "She's young. She's healthy. She don't talk back." Hiram said it like he was listing virtues, like he was proud. "She ain't spoke a word in going on 3 years. Quiet as a grave. You want a woman that don't cause trouble? Dutch, you ain't gonna find a quieter one." The men nearby had gone still. Not because they were offended. Because they were listening. Because some of them were interested. Lena felt the room settle around her like a trap closing. She breathed. She did not look up. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her middle finger, a small pain she had learned to use like an anchor, something real to hold on to when everything else became unreal. She did not look up. She did not make a sound. That was when she heard the boots. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, deliberate, the weight of a man who was used to moving across rough ground and had no intention of rushing for anyone. The sound came from the left, from somewhere near the front wall, where the shadows were thick and the crowd parted for it, not stepping aside politely, but moving the way animals move when something larger comes through. Without discussion. The pouch hit the bar. It hit hard enough that the pine plank jumped. Hard enough that the bottles at the near end rattled against each other. Hard enough that Dutch Pharaoh, who was not a man easily startled, pulled his eyes away from Lena and toward the sound. The man standing at the bar was tall, not theatrically tall, but the kind of tall that fills a doorway and makes a room feel smaller. He wore a heavy canvas coat, trapper cut, the kind designed for serious winters, and not for appearances. His hat was dark and battered. His face, what she could see of it in the lamp smoke, was not a gentle face. There was a scar that ran from just below his left eye down to the line of his jaw, pale and thick, the kind that comes from something with claws. His eyes were the gray of creek water in November. He was not looking at Dutch. He was not looking at Hiram. He was looking at her. Not the way the other men had been looking. Not calculating. Not hungry. Something else entirely. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that sat strange and still in the middle of all that noise. "That's raw gold," the man said. His voice was low, unhurried, built for spaces where sound carried far. "Weighed this morning. It covers the debt and then some." Dutch looked at the pouch, then at the man. "Cole Maddox," he said slowly. "You come down off the ridge." "I did. Haven't seen you in Bitter Creek in 2 winters?" "About that. What's your interest here?" Cole Maddox did not answer immediately. He reached out and picked up the pouch from the bar, walked it the length of the room to where Dutch Pharaoh stood, and set it down on the card table between them with the same unhurried deliberateness. Then he straightened. "I'm claiming the girl," he said. "Debts paid. Transactions done." The room erupted. Not in outrage, or not in the kind of outrage that comes from moral objection. More like the buzzing disruption of a hive disturbed. Men shouted questions. Someone laughed. Hiram Reed stepped forward with his jaw set. "Now hold on," Hiram said. "I ain't agreed to. The debt was yours," Cole said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Dutch holds the marker. Dutch decides if the gold covers it. Dutch." He looked at the gambler. "Does the gold cover it?" Dutch Pharaoh was a practical man. He picked up the pouch. He felt the weight of it. He set it back down. "It covers it," he said. Hiram's face went through several things in quick succession. Anger, calculation. Then the particular caving in that comes when a man realizes he has no ground left to stand on. "She's my niece," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "She was your debt," Cole said. "There's a difference." He turned then and looked at Lena directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. Come on then. She should have been frightened. Every logical part of what remained of her rational mind said that she should be terrified she was being claimed by a stranger, a scarred mountain trapper who spoke with the quiet authority of a man comfortable with violence. A man the entire saloon had stepped back from without being asked. She did not know him. She had no reason to trust him. She looked at him for one long moment. Then she walked toward him, not because she trusted him. Not yet, but because the alternative was Hiram Reed, and whatever unknown thing Cole Maddox represented, it was not that. It could not be worse than that. She had calculated the odds in the space of a single breath, and she had made her choice, and she walked toward the scarred man, and she did not look back at her uncle's face. Cole did not touch her. That was the first thing she noticed as they moved toward the saloon doors. He walked beside her, not behind her, not gripping her arm, not steering her, just moving alongside her through the crowd like they were simply going somewhere together, and all of this was ordinary. Men moved out of their way. She heard someone mutter something. She heard the sharp crack of Dutch's voice silencing it. The doors swung open. The cold hit like a fist. Montana, in November, did not ease you into itself. It simply arrived the air so sharp it made her eyes water immediately. The wind off the mountain carrying the smell of pine resin and snow that hadn't fallen yet, but was promising to. After the smoke and the body heat of the saloon, it felt like surfacing from deep water. Cole Maddox walked to a horse hitched at the post. A big gray animal built heavy, the kind suited for mountain trails rather than flat roads, and he checked the saddle straps before he said anything. "You ride?" he asked. She looked at him. He took that as a no. "I'll boost you up then. It's a long way." He paused. "I won't grab you without warning. I'll put my hands at your waist. You tell me if that's not all right." She blinked. He waited. She gave a small nod. He lifted her onto the horse with less effort than she expected, and with no more contact than he'd described. Then he stepped into the stirrup and swung up behind her. Settled, gathered the reins. She sat rigid, braced for something she'd been conditioned to expect, some comment, some entitlement, some reminder of what had just been paid for her, and none of it came. He clicked his tongue. The gray horse moved forward. The lights of Bitter Creek fell behind them. The mountain rose ahead. She had never been above the tree line. She had lived in Bitter Creek her whole life, all 22 years of it, and the mountain had always been something she looked at from a distance, present, enormous, and entirely out of reach. She watched it now from the back of Cole Maddox's horse as the trail climbed and the town lights disappeared and the trees closed in around them, dark and enormous branches heavy with old snow. He didn't speak for a long time. She didn't either, but her silence was habitual, worn smooth from years of practice. His felt different, not uncomfortable, not hostile, just present. "I'm not going to explain myself tonight," he said, eventually his voice low enough that it was nearly private beneath the sound of the wind. "You've had enough thrown at you for one evening. We'll get to the cabin, and you can sleep, and in the morning, things might make more sense." She turned her head slightly, a question she couldn't ask. "Why?" he said, like he'd heard it anyway. "You want to know why?" She didn't nod. She didn't have to. "Because you were standing there," he said. "And you shouldn't have been." That was all he offered. She turned back to face forward, and she thought about those words for the rest of the ride up the mountain, turned them over in her head, the way you turn over a strange stone you've found, looking at every facet of it, trying to understand what it was made of. Because you were standing there. And you shouldn't have been. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a rescue framed in heroic language. It was simply a statement of fact from a man who had seen something wrong and had the means to address it, and had done so. She had been standing in a place she should not have been standing. That was his entire explanation. She had received worse reasons from men who claimed to care about her. The cabin appeared out of the dark, like something grown rather than built low and solid, set back into the slope of the ridge, with the mountain at its back, chinked logs, and a heavy door, and a stone chimney already going cold. Cole brought the horse around to a small lean-to shelter, tied him saw to the feed before he did anything else. She stood in the snow and watched him work. He was efficient the way men are, who have learned to survive without anyone else's help. No wasted motion, no complaint about the cold, no performing of the task for an audience. He pushed open the cabin door and stood back to let her through first. She went in. The space was spare. A wood stove. A table. 2 chairs. A bunk against one wall with a rolled blanket on it. A shelf of supplies flour, dried meat coffee, a row of tin canisters. Trapping equipment on hooks near the door. Hides stacked in one corner. Everything functional, nothing decorative, nothing that spoke of comfort, sought, or sentiment kept. He came in behind her and went directly to the stove and began building a fire. She watched his hands as he worked, large hands scarred across the knuckles, but careful with the tinder. Careful with everything she was beginning to notice. Like a man who had learned that carelessness in the mountains cost you more than you could afford to pay. "Bunk's yours," he said. "I'll sleep on the floor." She looked at the bunk. She looked at the floor. He glanced at her. "I sleep on worse when I'm running trap lines. Don't concern yourself." He fed a longer piece of wood into the stove and straightened. "There's dried venison in the canister on the right and cornmeal in the left if you're hungry. Help yourself to what you need." She moved to the shelf. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She found the venison and tore off a piece and chewed it slowly, standing at the shelf, watching him settle the stove. The fire caught. The orange light spread across the low ceiling. The cold stopped being brutal and started just being cold. "I don't expect anything from you," Cole said. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was checking the stove damper. "In case that's what you're waiting to hear, I didn't buy a cook or a housekeeper or anything else. You're here because being there was worse. When you've had enough time to figure out what comes next, you can figure it out." He pulled a rolled blanket from somewhere under the bunk and spread it on the floor near the stove. "That's the only explanation I've got. Take it or leave it." She took it. She sat on the edge of the bunk and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and watched the fire through the iron grate of the stove, and she waited for the fear that should have been there. The calculation of threat, the vigilance she had maintained every night for 3 years, and it did not arrive in its usual form. Something else was there instead, something quieter and more fragile and far more dangerous than fear, because she had no name for it yet, and it did not behave the way she was used to things behaving. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. The small pain. The anchor. Cole Maddox rolled himself in the floor blanket with his back to her, and within minutes his breathing changed, and she understood that he had simply gone to sleep. Without drama. Without instruction. Without any further words. She sat there for a long time, listening to the wind against the cabin walls, and the settling of the fire, and the breathing of the man on the floor. Hiram used to talk in his sleep, muttering fragments of grievance and greed. She had lain awake for years listening to it through the thin wall between their rooms in the boarding house, that wet monologue of a man whose whole life was a list of things he felt owed. This man made no sound at all. She lay back on the bunk, the blanket pulled up, and she stared at the rough-hewn ceiling in the firelight, and she thought about the pouch of raw gold hitting the bar. She thought about the way the room had parted for him. She thought about because you were standing there and you shouldn't have been. She did not sleep for a long time. But it was the first night in years that she lay still, without her body staying coiled for impact, without every shift of sound in the dark registering as threat. The mountain outside was vast and cold and entirely indifferent to her existence, and for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, indifference felt like relief. Morning came gray and hard through the single window. She woke before he did and built the fire back up because it was something she knew how to do, and because doing something useful felt necessary, like a way of paying rent she could actually afford. She found the coffee tin and a battered pot and got water from the bucket near the door that had a thin skim of ice across the top that she broke with her knuckle. The smell of coffee woke him. Cole Maddox sat up from the floor with the unhurried focus of a man who never surfaced into panic, who came awake already oriented. He looked at her. He looked at the stove and the pot. He said, "Thank you." 2 words. Plain direct, no inflation. She gave a small nod and poured him a cup into the tin mug she'd found on the shelf, and he took it with both hands and drank it standing, looking at the window at the gray light on the snow. "I've got lines to check this morning," he said. "You stay here and stay warm. I'll be back before dark." He looked at her. "If you decide to leave, the trail back to Bitter Creek is south and downhill. It'll take most of the day on foot." He paused. "I won't stop you." She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. He pulled on his coat, checked his belt, and went out into the cold. She stood at the window and watched him disappear into the trees. Then she sat down at the table and drank her coffee in the silence of the mountain, and she thought about the trail south and the town at the bottom of it, and her uncle's hand around her arm, and the smell of the Mud Hen Saloon. She did not move toward the door. She wrapped both hands around the tin mug, and she sat in the cabin Cole Maddox had built with his own hands on the side of a mountain that had no interest in any human being's story, and she breathed. He came back before dark. He always did. The days began to stack one against the next, and each one was the same in its structure and different in its texture. He checked his lines. She maintained the cabin. He skinned and cured. She cooked what she knew how to cook and learned what she didn't. They moved around each other in the small space with a careful consideration that was not tenderness exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the awareness of another person's presence, and the deliberate decision not to crowd it. He did not ask her about her silence. No one had ever done that before. Not asked, not pried, not pushed. In Bitter Creek, people had filled the space her voice left with their own explanations, simple, slow, damaged, and she had allowed it because correcting them required words she wasn't ready to spend. Cole Maddox did not fill the space. He simply left it there available like a door he'd installed and never locked. She began cautiously to be curious about him. The scar she learned, not from him, but from observation, was old. Fully healed, pale silver, the kind of scar that had lost all its heat. He'd had it a long time. He touched it sometimes without noticing when he was thinking a habitual gesture she was fairly sure he wasn't aware of. He talked to the gray horse more than he talked to anything else, which she found privately remarkable. Complete sentences, calm narration of whatever he was doing, as though the animal's opinion were a reasonable thing to consult. She listened to those conversations through the cabin wall sometimes, and they told her more about him than anything he'd said directly. "We're losing the north line," she heard him say once on a morning when she was close enough to the lean-to that she could hear him clearly. "Ice is moving different this year. Reckon we move the sets down 20 yards and see if that changes the yield." The horse said nothing, obviously. "You're right, it's a gamble. Most things are." She pressed her hand to her mouth in the cabin doorway, and she did not make the sound that wanted to come out because she wasn't ready for that yet. But she felt it, the pressure of something attempting to return some capacity that had gone so long unused she'd believed it might be permanently closed. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. On the 14th day, he came back from the lines with a rabbit and a length of rope he'd found snagged on the north run, and he set the rope on the table and looked at her with the particular frown of a man working through a problem. "That snare wasn't set by me," he said. "Somebody's been working this ridge." He turned the rope over. "Could be a drifter, could be something else." He set it down. "I want to move the door bar to the inside instead of the outside. It'll hold better." She looked at the door. She looked at him. Then she walked to the shelf where his tools were and picked up the hammer and held it out to him handle first. He took it. He looked at her for a moment, not long, not dramatically, just a single beat of something she couldn't quite categorize. "You catch on fast," he said. She went back to what she was doing, but she felt the words settle somewhere in her chest and stay there warm and unusual, like an ember she hadn't expected to find. He had not told her she was good or pretty or useful in the ways men meant when they said such things. He had told her she caught on fast, like she was a capable person, like she was someone still in the process of becoming, not something already fixed and evaluated and assigned a value. She caught on fast. She held that thought all through that long, cold evening while the wind built outside and the first real snow of the season began to fall, and Cole Maddox sat across the table from her, sharpening his knife with a whetstone, the soft rhythmic sound of it filling the cabin, the way conversation might in some other life. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. For the first time in 3 years, the small pain felt less like an anchor and more like a habit she might someday not need. The snow that had started falling on that 14th night did not stop. It built slowly at first, the kind of snow that looks gentle from inside a warm cabin. Soft and deliberate, dusting the pine branches and filling in the tracks Cole had made that morning on his way to the north line. Lena watched it through the window while she kneaded the cornmeal dough she'd been learning to manage without it falling apart. And she thought it was almost beautiful the way it erased everything and left the world clean and undefined. By morning, she understood why Cole didn't trust it. He was up before first light, and the first thing he did was open the door, look at the sky, and close it again, with the careful precision of a man who has learned to read weather the way other men read faces. He stood with his hand still on the latch, and he didn't move for a long moment. "How bad?" she almost said. She didn't say it, but she thought it, and she watched his face for the answer. "We've got maybe 4 days before it gets serious," he said, not to her exactly, but not to the door either. "I need to pull the far line today and move the north sets before it gets any deeper." He turned and looked at her. "That means I'll be gone longer than usual. Full day, maybe into early dark." She set the dough down and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him directly, the question plain in her face. "You'll be fine," he said. There's enough wood stacked on the south side to keep the stove going 4 days. Don't let it get too low before you add. It's harder to build back up than to maintain." He paused. "Bar the door from the inside once I leave. Don't open it for anyone whose voice you don't know." She nodded. He pulled on his heaviest coat, the one with the wool lining she'd noticed he only wore when the temperature was going to drop hard, and checked his belt and his pack and his rifle, and he did all of it methodically without rushing, which she had come to understand was its own kind of seriousness. Cole Maddox only slowed down when something genuinely mattered. "I'll be back before full dark," he said. He went out. She barred the door. Then she stood in the middle of the cabin and listened to the silence that came in to replace him, and she recognized something in it that she hadn't felt since the first night. Not quite fear, but a cousin of it. Awareness. The understanding that the mountain was not indifferent to her existence in any friendly way. It was indifferent the way a cliff face is indifferent. It didn't want to harm her. It simply didn't care either way. She went back to the dough. She worked through the morning with methodical purpose, moving between tasks the way she'd watched Cole move between his, without performance, without wasted motion. She got the bread going on the flat stone beside the stove. She checked the wood supply, and found it exactly where he'd said it would be, stacked dense and dry against the south wall, enough to last longer than 4 days if she was careful. She melted snow in the pot for water and let it boil, and portioned it into the 2 tin canisters and put the lids on. She was useful. She had always been useful. That had been the one thing she'd been able to hold on to in Bitter Creek, that her hands worked, even when her voice did not, that she could cook and clean and calculate and manage, that whatever Hiram Reed had taken from her, he had not taken that. She thought about Hiram. She thought about him the way you think about a wound that's mostly healed, not with the original pain, but with the phantom awareness of where it had been. 3 years since she'd stopped speaking. She remembered the day clearly, though she rarely let herself stay with the memory long. She had been 19. He had sold her labor to a man in the next county to cover a debt the same way he'd eventually tried to sell her in the Mud Hen, and when she'd said no clearly, firmly, a single word, he had looked at her with a kind of cold violence that she'd never seen before in a human face, and she had understood in that moment that she was completely alone. She'd gone quiet after that, not because she couldn't speak, because silence was the only form of refusal that didn't cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. The snow kept falling. By midday it was coming down harder, and the wind had found the gaps in the cabin's chinking and was working its way through in thin, cold threads. She stuffed rags into the worst of them, working along the north wall, where Cole had marked some gaps with a piece of charred wood and clearly intended to re-chink when weather permitted. She did what she could. She added wood to the stove. She made the dough into 3 rounds and put them near the heat and watched them rise. She was proud of that quietly, in the way she'd learned to be proud of things without display, without anyone to show, just the private accounting of a thing done well. The afternoon stretched. She moved to the shelf where Cole kept his few books. She'd noticed them on the first day, and had not touched them, uncertain of the rules of the space, uncertain of everything. There were 3 of them. A Trapper's Guide to the Northern Ranges, well used, the spine cracked. A copy of the Old Testament, smaller the pages, tissue thin and soft from handling. And beneath those, face down, a leather-bound ledger that was not a ledger at all. She opened the first page and found dense, careful handwriting, small and precise. The kind of writing that comes from a man who learned his letters carefully and uses them sparingly. She should have put it back. She knew that. She read 3 pages before she caught herself. It wasn't a journal exactly. It was more like an accounting, not of money, but of observation. Weather patterns, game behavior, the movement of the creek in different seasons. Small notes about the mountain written in the same flat factual tone he used when he spoke, with occasional sentences that had no practical purpose whatsoever and were clearly written for no one but himself. One of them stopped her. She read it twice. "It occurs to me that silence is the loudest thing on this mountain. The men down in the creek town are afraid of it. They fill it with noise the way you fill a crack with plaster, not to make something better, only to stop feeling the air come through." She put the ledger back exactly where she'd found it, face down at the same angle. She sat down at the table, and she thought about that sentence for a long time. It occurs to me that silence is the loudest thing on this mountain. He understood it. He had understood it, probably before she arrived, had lived with it long enough to write about it in careful small handwriting in a ledger he kept face down on a shelf. She had assumed his comfort with her silence was tolerance, patience, the generosity of a man who had simply decided not to make demands. She was revising that assumption. The fire popped. She added wood. The dark came earlier than she expected, the storm pressing the light down and out ahead of schedule, and she lit the lamp and moved it to the table and sat with her hands folded and watched the door. Full dark arrived. Coal did not. She added more wood to the stove. She checked the bar on the door, solid, set properly. She moved the lamp back to the shelf so it wasn't in direct view of the window. Small precautions, automatic, the kind her body knew to take without being told. An hour past full dark, she heard the horse. She had learned its sound, the particular weighted rhythm of the gray horse moving on the trail above the cabin, the way the hoofbeats changed when he turned into the slope that led down to the lean-to. She knew it was them before she could have said how she knew. She went to the door and weighted her hand on the bar. She heard Cole's boots on the packed snow. Then she heard something else. A sound that didn't belong, a disruption in the rhythm of how he usually moved. Something dragging or irregular. A hesitation between steps that made the hair on her arms stand up beneath her sleeves. "It's me," he called. His voice was the same pitch it always was, but she heard the effort in it. The deliberate steadiness of a man managing something. "Don't alarm yourself." She unbarred the door and opened it. He was standing on his own 2 feet. That was the first thing she checked. The second thing she checked was the dark stain on his left leg, below the knee, where the canvas of his trousers had gone black and wet. He had his rifle under one arm and was using it as a third point of support, leaning slightly, and his face had the gray, drained look of a man who has been spending blood and warmth for hours and is running low on both. "There was a trap," he said before she could react. "Not mine. Set on the north run. Steel jaws, no marker. I didn't see it until—" He stopped. Breathed. "It caught my leg. I got it open. It's not, I've had worse." She stepped back and held the door wide. He came in. He sat down heavily in the chair nearest the door, and she could see now in the lamplight how bad it was. The bleeding had slowed. He'd tied something around the wound, a piece of his own shirt stripped off at the hem. But slow was not stopped, and the cold had been working on him for however long it had taken him to get down the mountain on a leg that should not have been bearing weight. She didn't hesitate. She moved to the shelf and took down the whiskey, one bottle kept for exactly the kind of necessity that lived on mountain ridges, and she brought it to the table, along with the sewing kit she'd found in the 3rd week, a small tin box containing needles and heavy thread that she'd reorganized and knew the contents of by heart. She brought the lamp close. She brought the cleanest cloth she had. "You don't have to," Cole started. She gave him a look that stopped the sentence cold. He looked at her. He looked at the supplies she'd laid out. He looked back at her face. "All right," he said quietly. She cut the tied cloth away with the small knife from his belt. She simply reached across him and took it from its sheath without asking, because asking would have required words, and words were not what this moment needed. She pulled the canvas back from the wound, and she looked at it without looking away, because looking away would not help him, and she was done with doing things that didn't help. It was bad. The jaws had caught him on the outer edge of the lower leg. Not the bone, she thought, or he'd never have made it down the mountain. But the flesh was torn in 2 places, and the cold had complicated everything, slowing the blood, but also slowing the healing response, and it would need cleaning, and it would need closing. And both of those things were going to hurt considerably. She picked up the whiskey bottle. She looked at him. "Do it," he said. She poured. He made one sound, short, bitten off. His jaw clamped hard, and then he was silent, and she cleaned the wound with methodical thoroughness, her hands not shaking, her breathing, even some part of her that had always existed beneath the silence rising to the surface and taking over the way it had been waiting to for a long time. She threaded the needle. She looked at him again. "I've had stitches before," he said. His voice was tight but controlled. "Do what needs doing." She did what needed doing. He did not make another sound through the stitching. She counted 12 small, and even pulling the torn flesh closed with a precision that surprised her, until she remembered that she had watched the town doctor work twice, and had the kind of hands that learned from watching. She tied off the thread. She packed the wound with a strip of clean cloth and bound it firm. She sat back. Her hands were shaking now, not during, but after. She pressed them flat on her thighs and breathed. Cole looked down at the bound leg. He looked up at her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. She met his eyes. After a long moment, she held up 2 fingers. He understood she had seen it done twice. He looked at the stitching again. Then he looked back at her with something in his expression she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not gratitude exactly. Something with more weight than gratitude. "You did that better than the man in Bitter Creek who calls himself a doctor," he said. She looked away before he could see what that did to her face. She cleaned up the supplies and put the whiskey back and banked the stove, and through all of it she felt the evening recalibrating around her, something shifting in the air between them that she had no accurate word for. He had been the one with the weight of this arrangement from the beginning, the one who'd made the decision, the one who knew the mountain, the one who understood how to survive in a place that had no interest in anyone's survival. And now he'd sat still and let her take his knife from his belt, without asking, and close his wound without flinching, and they both understood that something had changed in the geometry of whatever this was. She made him eat. She put the bread she'd baked that afternoon on the table with the dried venison and the last of the preserved beans. And she pointed at the chair, and he sat in it, or rather stayed in it, since he hadn't moved much, and he ate and she ate across from him. And they sat in the cabin on the side of the mountain, while the storm pressed down on the roof and said nothing, and that said everything. "Whoever set that trap on my line," Cole said when his plate was empty, "wasn't doing it for game." She looked up. "Those jaws were set at ankle height," he said. "Calibrated for a man's stride, not an animal's. Somebody knows this ridge." He turned the thought over visibly. "Nobody works this ridge except me." She thought about the rope, the one he'd brought back 2 weeks ago, the one found snagged on the north run. She went to the shelf where he'd left it and brought it to the table and set it down. He looked at it, then at her. "You've been thinking about that," he said. It was not a question. She sat down and pulled the rope toward her and turned it over until she found the end she'd noticed when he first brought it in, the way it had been cut, the specific angle of the cut, clean and deliberate, not frayed. She pointed at it. He leaned forward, looked. His jaw tightened. "That's a clean cut," he said. "Not wear, not tearing." He sat back. "Someone cut that deliberately and left it there to be found." He was quiet for a moment. "Or not found. Either way." She folded her hands on the table and waited. "You're thinking something," he said. She reached out and touched the rope, then pointed at the wound on his leg, then held up one finger and raised her eyebrows. He understood her meaning. "Same person. Could be," he said. "Could be coincidence. Up here, I give coincidence about the same credit I give wishful thinking, which is none." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I need to think on who knows this ridge and who'd have reason to want me out of it." The fire settled. The storm pressed. She watched his face work through the problem the way she'd watched it. Work through mechanical ones, the same focused attention, the same willingness to sit with an uncomfortable thing until it resolved. "Hiram Reed knows some men," he said eventually, and quietly, like he didn't want to say it. "Men who run supplies between the mining camps. One of them has worked this mountain. I've seen his campfire signs twice in the western draw." She felt something move through her chest, cold and specific. "I'm not saying it's connected," Cole said. He looked at her directly. "I'm saying I don't know that it ain't." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand that." She understood it. She had understood it the moment he came through that door with his leg torn open, because she had understood the moment Dutch Pharaoh looked at her in the Mud Hen Saloon that some men did not accept the closure of a transaction they hadn't agreed to. Hiram Reed had not agreed to this. Dutch had taken the gold. Dutch was practical, and practical men accepted mathematics. But Hiram was not practical. Hiram was proud in the stupid, self-destructive way of men who have nothing real to be proud of, and pride did not respond to mathematics the way debt did. She stood up. She went to the door. She checked the bar, still set solid. She went to the window. Nothing visible through the snow and dark. "Lena." Cole's voice behind her, quiet, level. She turned. He was watching her from the table. "I want you to hear me on something." She waited. "You are not cargo," he said. "You are not the reason this is happening, if it's happening. Whatever Hiram Reed is or isn't doing, that is a consequence of who he is and what he is, not of anything you did or didn't do." He held her eyes. "You understand that?" She stood very still. "Because I've seen the way you look when his name comes up," Cole said. "Like you're already calculating what it cost to be in his vicinity. I'm asking you to stop doing that accounting. It was never your debt." She turned back to the window because she did not trust her face. She stood there a long time. Behind her, she heard him shift in the chair, heard the careful way he repositioned the injured leg, heard him breathe slowly against the pain of it. She heard all of that, and she stood at the window, and she thought about 3 years of silence, and a thumbnail pressed into a palm, and a boarding house wall thin enough to hear through, and she thought about what it would mean to actually believe what he'd just said. Not your debt. The snow fell. The days that followed were confined ones. Cole could not run his lines on the injured leg, and the storm made the idea moot regardless. They were in the cabin together for stretches longer than they'd ever managed, and the space that had seemed adequate before began to make its dimensions felt. He was not a difficult man to be confined with. That was the thing she kept returning to, with a kind of wondering she'd never expected to feel about any man. He was quiet when quiet was what the moment called for. He found work to do with his hands, mending, sharpening, working through a backlog of small repairs he'd been putting off, and he did it without filling the silence with unnecessary noise. She worked alongside him in the same mode. It was a strange and specific kind of companionship built out of parallel industry and the occasional exchange of look or gesture, and it was more comfortable than any conversation she could remember having with anyone. On the second day of the storm, he caught her reading. She'd taken one of the 2 regular books off the shelf, The Trapper's Guide, which she'd been working through with more genuine interest than she'd expected, and she'd been so absorbed in a section about reading snow conditions for game movement that she hadn't heard him come in from the lean-to. She looked up, and he was standing in the doorway with a load of wood and an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "You read," he said. She tilted the book slightly in acknowledgement. "I figured you for it," he said. He came in and stacked the wood without making a production of the statement. "The way you looked at the shelf those first few days, like you were deciding something." He said nothing more about it. But an hour later, without comment, he moved the ledger, the one she'd already read 3 pages of, and replaced carefully to the far end of the shelf where it was easier to reach, as if by accident. She did not touch it again that day. She touched it the next morning when he was in the lean-to. She read it for an hour, carefully making no marks and leaving no evidence. And what she found in those pages was a man she had not expected to find at all, not because he hid himself, but because she had not thought to look. The ledger was observations mostly, mountain and weather and game. But scattered through it in the same small, careful handwriting were other things. A sentence about the sound a particular ridge made in specific wind conditions that he found as he wrote it to be a kind of music he had no name for. A paragraph about a hawk he'd watched for 3 days on the eastern face, tracking it not for any practical reason, but because it was the word he used was extraordinary, and she could see in the handwriting that he'd written it, and then almost crossed it out, and then left it. A note 3 lines long from what she calculated was about 6 weeks before the night in the Mud Hen Saloon. "There are things a man can live without that he does not know he is living without, until he has already gone a long time without them. I am not sure I could name the thing, but it has a quality of presence, a quality of, I don't know the word, I will leave the space. He had left a space, a literal gap in the line like a blank in a form. She stared at that space for a long time. Then she put the ledger back and went to the stove and checked the bread and stood with her back to the cabin door and breathed through something that was coming up in her chest like spring water through frozen ground. Too much pressure, too long. A time coming and nowhere yet to go. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready. But she also understood with the steady clarity of a woman who had learned to read things accurately because her survival had depended on accuracy, that whatever was happening in this cabin on the side of this mountain was real, and it was happening whether she was ready or not. On the fourth day, the storm began to ease. Cole came in from checking the horse with snow on his shoulders and a different quality of attention on his face. "It's breaking," he said. "By tomorrow morning, we'll have clear enough to move." He sat down. He looked at her with the particular directness he used when he was going to say something he'd considered carefully. "I need to tell you something." She sat across from him. "Before I came down to Bitter Creek," he said, "before the mud hen, I'd been hearing things from the supply runners who come through the ridge in late season." He paused. There was talk about Hiram Reed, about what he was planning. He'd been telling men he was going to settle a debt by selling his niece to Dutch Pharaoh, and that Dutch was going to use her in a way that had nothing to do with housekeeping. The cabin was very quiet. "I want you to know I didn't come down there because I wanted something," Cole said. His voice was entirely level. "I came because I heard that, and I had the gold, and it seemed like it was the only thing I could do that made sense in the time available." He held her gaze. "I want you to understand the difference." She understood the difference. She had understood it. She realized from the first night from the way he'd told her the trail south was there, and he wouldn't stop her. From the bunk and the floor. From "you catch on fast," said, like it was simply true and not like he was offering her something in exchange for it. She looked at him across the table, and she felt the thumbnail against her palm habit reflex, and she thought, not your debt, not your fault, not a transaction. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his, briefly. "Just a moment, the way you place a hand on something to feel, whether it's real," and then she took it back and folded both hands in her lap. Cole Maddox looked at the table where her hand had been. He looked up. He said nothing. Neither did she. But she felt the space between them change again, not close exactly, but rearranged like furniture moved to better suit the actual shape of the room. Something settled. Something acknowledged without being named the way Cole's ledger left a gap for the word he didn't have yet. Outside, the storm was easing its grip on the ridge. Inside the cabin, something else entirely was just beginning to find its footing, fragile and new, and built on the most unlikely foundation. Two people could share a saloon and a pouch of gold, and the particular revelation of what a person will do when someone treats them like they are still in the process of becoming. She banked the stove for the night. He moved the floor blanket into position without being asked. The lamp burned low, and somewhere on the ridge in the cold and the dark and the thinning storm, a rope with a deliberate cut end lay under new snow, and steel jaws sat reset on a trail that only one man walked regularly, and the particular trouble that had followed Lena Carter out of the Mud Hen Saloon had not gone anywhere at all. It was simply waiting for better weather. The better weather Cole had predicted arrived the way most things on that mountain arrived, without ceremony, without apology, simply there when it hadn't been before. The storm broke overnight and left behind a silence so complete that Lena woke before dawn, just from the absence of wind. The sudden stillness loud in its own way, the way a clock stopping is louder than a clock ticking. She lay on the bunk and listened to it. Cole was already awake. She could tell from his breathing, or the lack of the particular quality of stillness that came over him when he slept. He was on his back on the floor, and he was thinking. She had learned the difference. "Storm's done," he said into the dark. She made a small sound. It surprised her, not a word, just an acknowledgement, a small hum of agreement, and she heard him register it, the way he registered most things quietly without drawing attention to it. "I'll need to run the lines today," he said. Check what the snow took and what it didn't. And I need to look at where that trap was set. See what else might be waiting up there." She sat up. She swung her feet to the floor. She was already reaching for her boots before he said the next thing. "I'd rather you didn't come," he said. She stopped. "I know." His voice was careful. "I know you don't want to stay here again. But if someone's been on that ridge with the intent, I think they had, I need to move fast, and I need to move quiet, and I can't do either if I'm—" He paused. "If I've got something to worry about." She sat very still, with one boot in her hand. He got up off the floor. She heard him move to the stove and add wood, heard the familiar sounds of the morning building itself around them. Then he came and crouched in front of her. Not something he'd done before, putting himself at her eye level deliberately. And she looked at his face in the gray pre-dawn light coming through the window. "You are not a burden," he said. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you are something I would rather have safe, and those are different things. You understand the difference by now, I think." She looked at him for a long moment. She put her boot on. Both boots. She stood up, walked to the shelf, and took down the small hunting knife he kept there. Not his belt knife, the shorter one. The one he'd told her in the second week was for skinning, but worked fine for other things, and she held it out to him, handle first. He took it. "I'll be back before noon," he said. He went out into the cold white morning, and she barred the door and stood in the cabin that had become, in the space of not very many weeks, the first place she had felt safe in 3 years. And she thought about steel jaws set at ankle height and a rope with a deliberate cut. And she moved the bar on the door and checked it twice, and then went to make coffee, and tried to keep her hands occupied, because occupied hands did not shake. He was not back before noon. She knew by the quality of the light when noon had passed, the way it shifted through the window, the angle of it changing on the floor. She went on with what she was doing. She told herself the lines were longer than usual. The snow had complicated the terrain, his leg was still healing, and he was moving slower than normal. She told herself all the reasonable things. She checked the door bar a third time. She went to the window. The tree line at the top of the trail was still. The snow on the branches had not been disturbed. No shape moved through it. She went back to the stove. 1 o'clock, she thought. Maybe 1 o'clock when she heard the horse. But the horse was moving wrong. She was at the window before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The gray horse was coming down the trail without a rider. She registered that in one cold instant, and then she saw Cole on foot coming through the trees behind it, walking hard, one hand braced against the trunks as he passed them. Not using them for support, using them as cover. Behind him, farther up the trail, she saw movement. 2 shapes. Men. Moving through the tree line fast. Her body made its decisions before her mind caught up. She went to the door and unbarred it and pulled it open, and Cole crossed the last 50 yards of open ground between the tree line and the cabin, at a speed that his injured leg had no business allowing. And he came through the door, and she slammed it shut behind him, and her hands were already on the bar before he said a word. "Bar it," he said. She had already barred it. He was breathing hard, controlled, but hard, and he had his rifle in his hand, and his eyes were on the window. She moved to the other side of the window frame and pressed flat against the wall, the way she'd seen him do once when he was showing her how the cabin's angles worked, which she'd thought at the time was hypothetical information. It was not hypothetical. 2 men, he said quietly, his back against the wall. I made them at the North Run. They'd pulled my remaining traps and reset them along the main trail, the trail I have to take to get back down here. He glanced at her. They weren't there to steal pelts. She felt the cold spread through her chest. Not fear exactly. Something colder and more specific. I came the long way, he said, through the eastern draw. It took longer. They know the cabin's here. They were heading this direction when I lost the visual in the trees. He checked the rifle, checked it again, set it against the wall within reach, and drew the shorter knife, the one she'd handed him, from his belt, and checked that too. Old habits. Efficient. There's a rifle above the door. You've seen me clean it. She had seen him clean it. She had watched his hands on the mechanism 3 times, and she understood how it worked in the way she understood most things, by watching carefully and trusting that her hands would follow. She reached up and took the rifle down. Cole looked at her. She checked the load the way she'd watched him do it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when something real needed doing. She had figured that out about herself in the last weeks that the shake came after, never during. "You know how to use that," he said, not a question. She looked at him evenly. "All right," he said, outside nothing. The particular held breath quality of open ground between the cabin and the tree line and whatever was in the trees. Then a voice, "Maddox." Loud, unhurried from the direction of the eastern tree line. A man who'd walked these ridges before, she thought, because he wasn't breathing hard. "We know you're in there. We've got no quarrel with you. We're just here for the girl." Cole said nothing. "Hiram Reed sent us," the voice continued. "She's his kin, and he's got a right. The gold you paid Dutch don't change blood relation. The law says." "The law," Cole said not loudly, just pitched to Carrie, "is 4 days' ride from this ridge. You want to talk about the law, you can wait 4 days. Silence from outside. Then, "We don't need to wait." Cole moved to the window, staying to the side out of the direct line, and looked out. He came back to the wall. "One of them moved around the south side," he said quietly. "They're trying to split our attention." He looked at her. "If they get to the lean-to, they can use the horse's leverage. I'm not going to let that happen." She put her hand on his arm. One sharp grip, then released. He looked at her. She pointed at herself, then at the window, then at him, then at the door. He read it. She stays at the window, covers the south side. He goes to the door, holds the approach. "No," he said. She pointed at the window again. "Lena?" She put the rifle up to her shoulder and settled it with a familiarity that was half observed and half something innate, something in her hands that had always been there, and she looked at him over the barrel with an expression that said everything she needed to say without a single word. He stared at her. "Fine," he said. He moved to the door. He unbarred it, just the bar, not the latch, and crouched beside it with the knife ready and the door a 1/4 inch ajar, enough to see through. Outside, the voice again. "Last chance, Maddox. Send her out and we walk away. Nobody gets—" The sound of something hitting the south wall stopped the sentence. Cole went through the door. She heard it before she could see it through the window, the sharp sounds of men who've stopped talking and started moving. She tracked the south yard through the window, and she saw the second man come around the corner of the cabin at a run, and she put the rifle barrel through the window gap, and she fired. She missed. She'd known she probably would. The angle was bad, and she'd never fired this particular rifle. But the shot cracked across the open ground, and the man stopped and went sideways. And in that half-second of stopped momentum, Cole came around the corner from the other direction, and there was a short, brutal struggle that she watched with her heart in her throat, both hands on the rifle ready to reload, watching. Cole was bigger and meaner, and on his home ground, injured leg or not. The man went down. The first voice from the eastern tree line shouted something, and then there was silence, and then she heard footsteps retreating fast through the snow, the sound of someone who had decided that the situation had not unfolded according to plan. She was at the door when Cole came back around the corner. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his hand. His hand, not the wound. She registered that immediately. His knuckles. She pulled the door open. He came in. He sat down in the chair. She was already moving watercloth, checking the leg first, because that was the most likely thing to have reopened. She crouched and checked the bandage. Still intact. She looked up at his face. He was pale with the particular pallor of spent adrenaline. "The other one ran," he said. "The one I got won't be going anywhere tonight. I left him tied to the lean-to post, which he should find instructive." He looked at his hand. "I hit the wall," he said with a tone that suggested he found this mildly irritating. "Not him." She took his hand and looked at it. 2 knuckles split. She cleaned them and wrapped them without ceremony, and set his hand back in his lap. "You fired?" he said. She looked up. "You fired without hesitating," he said. She met his eyes and held them. "I told you no," he said. "About the window." She continued to hold his eyes. He looked away first. "You were right," he said quietly. "I don't like it, but you were right." He rubbed his face with his uninjured hand. He had another 2 seconds before he cleared the corner. 2 more seconds and the angle changes, and I don't see him until he's already... He stopped. "You bought me those 2 seconds." She sat back on her heels. Outside, somewhere on the far side of the lean-to, the tied man had apparently recovered enough to start expressing his feelings about his situation. The sound was muffled, but emphatic. Cole looked at the wall in that direction. "He'll want water before nightfall," he said. "And a blanket, because I am apparently not the kind of man who leaves people to freeze to death even when they've earned it." She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, hard, because the alternative was making a sound she wasn't ready to make. "Lena," he said. She looked at him. "Are you all right?" No one had asked her that in 3 years either. Not the way he asked it, not as a polite noise, not as a precursor to a demand. Just the question itself, direct and real, wanting an actual answer. She thought about it honestly. Then she gave a small nod that meant, "I will be." He seemed to accept that as the truth it was. He let her take the rifle from where she'd propped it and clean and reload it while he sat in the chair and came back to himself, and she felt the afternoon resettle around them, shaken, rearranged, but still standing. The man tied to the lean-to post was named Garrett, which she learned 2 hours later when Cole brought him inside, not out of sentiment, but because the temperature was dropping again, and a dead man in the lean-to would be a worse problem than a live one at the table. He was perhaps 30 heavy set, with the look of a man who'd worked rough jobs long enough that his face had stopped bothering to change expression. He sat in the chair across from Cole, and she stood at the shelf with her back to both of them, because it was that, or look at him, and she couldn't look at him yet without something happening in her chest that she didn't want to deal with in front of anyone. "Who hired you?" Cole said. Not asked. Said. "Read," Garrett said. He didn't seem particularly interested in pretending otherwise. $100 to bring the girl back to Bitter Creek." $100, Cole said. He said the law was on his side, family claim. "And you believed that?" Garrett shrugged. "I believed $100. She turned around then. She stood at the shelf, and she looked at the man who had come up a mountain in the snow, with steel jaws and $100 reason to take her back to Bitter Creek, and she felt something move through her that was not fear and was not exactly anger. It was something older than both, something that had been building since the night in the Mudhen Saloon, since before that, even since a boarding house wall and a thin voice saying no, and a cold violence in a man's eyes, and 3 years of silence. Garrett looked at her, then looked away. Even he could feel it. "You'll stay here tonight," Cole said to him. "Tomorrow you'll walk down to Bitter Creek, and you'll deliver a message for me to Hiram Reed." He leaned forward slightly. "You tell him the girl isn't coming back. You tell him the gold was a legal transaction in front of witnesses in a public establishment, and Dutch Pharaoh himself took the payment. You tell him if I see another man on this ridge who didn't get an invitation from me, I will come down that mountain myself, and I have a considerably longer memory than his patience." Garrett absorbed this. "He ain't gonna like that." "I know it," Cole said. "Tell him anyway." She woke in the night to silence so complete it almost had weight. The lamp had burned out. The stove had cooled to the level where the fire was still live, but quiet, just orange coals behind the iron grate. Garrett was asleep on the floor near the door, snoring with the total commitment of a man without much conscience. Cole was at the table. She realized he hadn't slept. She lay still and watched him in the orange firelight. He had his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, not sleeping, not doing anything practical, just sitting in the dark, being awake with whatever was in his head. She had never seen him like this. He was always occupied, always purposeful. Even his resting had a quality of readiness to it. This was different. She sat up slowly. He heard her. She knew he heard her. He heard everything, but he didn't move. She got up. She went to the stove and put 2 more pieces of wood in and settled the damper, and then she went to the table and sat down across from him. He lifted his face from his hands. He looked at her. "I should have anticipated this," he said. "I should have known Reed wouldn't accept it, and I should have been prepared, and I wasn't, and today could have—" He stopped. "It could have been different." She shook her head. "I'm not asking for absolution," he said. She shook her head again differently this time, and reached across the table and picked up the ledger from where it sat and opened it to a blank page near the back and pushed it across to him with his own pencil. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You want me to write something down?" She pointed at the ledger and then pointed at herself. He understood. She was giving him the same offer the ledger had always provided him, a space to put the thing that didn't fit in regular speech. He picked up the pencil. He wrote for perhaps 2 minutes, small, careful, deliberate. Then he turned the ledger around and pushed it back across to her. She read it. "There are things a man takes on because they are right, and then discovers they are something more than right, and that additional weight is its own particular kind of responsibility. I am not afraid of responsibility. I am afraid of failing it. Those are different things." She read it twice. Then she reached out and took the pencil from beside the ledger and wrote below his words in the careful print she'd used since childhood, because her cursive had never been elegant. "You didn't fail it today." She pushed it back. He read it. He sat with it for a moment. Then very quietly he wrote one more line. She pulled the ledger back and read it. "Neither did you." She sat across from Cole Maddox in the orange firelight of a cabin on the side of a mountain that had no interest in either of them, and she felt something in her chest give way, not breaking, not collapsing, but releasing. The way a door gives way when the bar is finally lifted from the inside. 3 years of quiet. 3 years of thumbnails and anchors and armor made of silence. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, and then deliberately she stopped. She put both hands flat on the table. Cole looked at her hands, then at her face. He had never missed much, and he did not miss this. He said nothing. He did not make it into something it couldn't yet support. He simply sat there in the dark with her across the table, and the fire built itself back up behind the grate, and Garrett snored his uncomplicated snore, and outside the mountain was cold and enormous, and entirely indifferent. Inside was different. Inside was 2 people sitting with something new and nameless and fragile between them, tended the way you tend to fire in the early stages, carefully, without too much air, not yet ready for a larger fuel. In the morning, Garrett walked south. Cole watched him go from the door of the cabin, one hand on the frame. Lena stood at the table behind him. She watched Cole watch the man disappear into the tree line, and she read the set of his shoulders, not relief, not satisfaction. Something more complicated. The posture of a man who knows a thing is not finished. He turned around. "He'll tell Reed," he said, "and Reed will make a decision." She waited. Reed's going to have to decide whether $100 and his pride is worth a real confrontation with a man who knows this mountain the way he knows his own hands, Cole said. "And I don't know which way he'll land on that." He looked at her directly. "I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know." She appreciated the honesty. She always had. She walked to the shelf, and she took down the tin canister where she'd been keeping something for the last 2 weeks, not food, not supplies. She opened it, and she put it on the table. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Cole crossed to the table and looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" She opened it carefully. It was a document. She had found it in the lining of the bag she'd had with her the night in the Mud Hen, the bag Hiram had let her take because it looked empty, and he'd never thought to check the lining. She had not told Cole it existed because she hadn't understood yet whether it mattered. She was beginning to understand that it mattered considerably. Cole leaned over the table and read it. He read it a second time. He straightened. "This is a deed," he said. She nodded. "To land in Bitter Creek." He looked at her. "To a parcel in Bitter Creek that includes the stretch of creek frontage where the primary ore processing operation is running." She nodded again. "Whose name is on this?" She pointed to the name on the document. His jaw tightened. "Your father's name." She pointed to the date. "Filed 12 years ago." He straightened fully now. His whole posture changed, not agitated but sharpened, focused in the way of a man who has just seen a set of pieces rearrange themselves into a picture he should have seen before. Hiram Reed has been collecting income from that creek frontage for how long? She held up all 10 fingers, then 3 more. 13 years. 13 years, he said quietly. Your father died. She held up 10 fingers. 10 years ago. He looked at the deed. He looked at her. And Reed told the mining company what? That he was the rightful owner. That the land passed to him. She nodded. But it didn't. She shook her head. It passed to you. She pressed her hand flat on the document. Cole Maddox stood at the table in his cabin on the side of a Montana mountain, and he looked at the woman across from him. The woman who had stood in a smoke-filled saloon without making a sound, who had stitched his leg with steady hands, who had fired a rifle through a window without hesitating, who had sat across from him in the dark, and put both hands flat on the table, and stopped pressing her thumbnail into her palm, and she watched him understand the full shape of what Hiram Reed was. Not a desperate man with gambling debts. A thief. A calculated long-term thief who had silenced his niece, who had systematically broken her down until silence was her only defense, because a woman who didn't speak couldn't make claims in a courtroom, or a land office, or a saloon, or anywhere else. He needed you quiet, Cole said. She looked at him steadily. That's why, Cole said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, low and level, and containing something cold in it, not rage, but the particular temperature of a man who has understood something and is deciding what to do with the understanding. Not just broken, quiet. Specifically, legally, permanently quiet. She folded her hands over the deed. He looked at her hands on it. How long have you known? He said. She touched the lining of the bag. Then she looked at him and spread her hands. A few weeks, not long. Why didn't you tell me? She looked at the document, then at him. Then she made a small gesture, hands open, a question without a question. He read it accurately. She wasn't sure what it would change. She wasn't sure what he would do with it. She wasn't sure it was safe to hand to anyone, because the people who'd known about it had not fared well. It changes everything, Cole said. She knew that. Reed didn't sell you to pay debts, Cole said. He sold you to get rid of you permanently. Because you're alive, and you know what's in that deed, and as long as you're alive and connected to anyone who can read a legal document and knows where to file it. He stopped. She had already worked through this. She had been working through it for 2 weeks, lying on the bunk at night while Cole slept on the floor, turning it over. The way she turned over every problem methodically, without hurry, looking at every facet. She reached across the table and picked up the pencil and opened the ledger to a blank page and wrote 4 words. She turned it around. Cole read it. What do we do? He looked at the 4 words for a long time. She watched his face, the working of it, the weight of it, the particular quality of a man who is calculating not just a problem, but his own position within it, and whether what he's about to commit to is something he actually means. He picked up the pencil. He wrote 2 words beneath hers. He turned the ledger back around. She read them. We fight. She sat with those 2 words and she felt the thumbnail reflex come, and she let it pass without acting on it, and she folded her hands together on the table instead. And she looked at Cole Maddox across the ledger where they'd been writing their way toward each other for weeks, and she felt something she had no name for yet, but that had the quality of that word he'd written once and almost crossed out. Extraordinary. Outside, somewhere on the trail, south, Garrett was walking toward Bitter Creek with a message. And Hiram Reed, who had sold his niece for gambling debts, who had spent 13 years stealing a dead man's land, who had sent 2 men up a mountain with $100 and steel jaws between them, was about to discover that the quiet girl he'd broken was no longer quite so broken, and nowhere near as quiet as he'd counted on. They went down the mountain 3 days later. Cole's leg had held through the confrontation with Garrett and the cold that followed, but Lena had watched the wound each morning with the careful attention of someone who understood that what looked fine on the surface could be quietly failing underneath, and on the second day she'd made him sit still and unwrapped it and inspected it with the lamp close, and it was healing not fast but clean. No heat in the surrounding flesh. No smell that didn't belong. She'd rewrapped it tighter, and he'd said nothing except to watch her hands while she worked. And she'd felt his eyes on her the way you feel sunlight through a window, specific and warm and present. On the third morning, she woke to find the ledger open on the table to the page where they'd written, "We fight." And below that, in Cole's small, careful hand, a list. She sat down in her bunk blanket and read it. It was not a plan for violence. It was a legal sequence, specific, ordered, the kind of thinking that came from a man who had spent years alone with enough quiet to actually think things through. The deed needed to be presented to the federal land office in Helena, not the local outfit in Bitter Creek, which Reed had spent 13 years making comfortable with his version of things. A federal filing would supersede any local claim. The mining company operating on the creek frontage would need to be notified directly because they were paying lease income to a man with no legal right to collect it, which made them a party to the fraud whether they knew it or not. At the bottom of the list, underlined once, "You need to be there, in person, speaking." She sat with that line a long time. He came in from the lean-to and saw her with the ledger, and he didn't say anything immediately. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and waited. "I know what that asks," he said finally. "I know it asks more than anything else on that list." She put her finger under the underlined sentence and looked at him. "A written filing can be contested," he said. "Reed's had 13 years to build relationships in this territory. A document without a living claimant present to defend it is easier to lose, easier to delay, easier to bury in process." He held her gaze. "But a woman standing in front of a federal officer making a direct statement that's considerably harder to make disappear." She looked at the sentence again. She thought about the Mudhen Saloon and what her voice had cost her the last time she'd used it. She thought about Hiram's face when she'd said no. She thought about 3 years and a thumbnail. She closed the ledger. She stood up and went to the shelf and took down her bag, the one with the deed in the lining, and she put it on the table in front of Cole. Then she went to the door and took his heavy coat off the hook and held it out to him. He looked at the coat. He looked at her face. "All right," he said. "We go today." The ride down was different from the ride up. She knew the mountain now, the way you know a thing you've been living alongside, not intimately, not entirely, but enough that it had stopped being alien. The gray horse moved below her with the same steady patience it always had, and Cole rode close but not crowding, and the air was cold and sharp, and the snow on either side of the trail was marked with animal tracks. She could now identify most of deer rabbit, what was probably a fox, the wide, shallow prints of a snowshoe hare. She watched the tree line as they rode. Cole watched it too. She knew because she could feel the quality of his attention, that particular alertness he carried when he was on open ground, without the cabin walls around him, not paranoid, but present, reading the terrain. The way the ledger said, he read everything. Nothing moved. The mountain let them go. Bitter Creek appeared below them in the mid-morning light, smaller than she remembered, or maybe just smaller now that she was coming back to it from above, rather than being trapped inside it. Smoke from chimneys. The sound of the stamp mill working the ore. The particular noise of a mining town that never fully stopped, because the mountain didn't care what day of the week it was. She felt her spine straighten without deciding to. Cole noticed. He said nothing. They came into town from the North Trail, and immediately she felt the eyes. Bitter Creek was not a large place, and strangers were noted. But she was not a stranger, and that was worse. She was a returned thing, a woman who'd been sold, and apparently come back, and that sat wrong with people. The way any disruption to the accepted narrative sits wrong in a small town. She saw it in the way conversation stopped, in the way a man outside the feed store watched them ride past and then turned and went inside quickly, which meant he was going somewhere with what he'd seen. She kept her eyes forward. "Dutch Pharaoh first," Cole said quietly. "He witnessed the transaction. I want his corroboration on record before Reed knows we're here." She gave a small nod. They tied the horse at the rail outside the Mudhen, not open yet at this hour, but the side door was unlocked as she'd known it would be, Because Dutch Pharaoh ran his business the way serious men run serious businesses, which is to say without stopping. Cole knocked twice. A pause. The door opened. Dutch Pharaoh looked at Cole, then at Lena. His expression did what Dutch Pharaoh's expression rarely did, which was register something. "Maddox," he said, "I heard you had some trouble on the ridge." "I did," Cole said. "Garrett talked to you." "Garrett talked to everyone." Dutch stepped back from the door. "Come in." The saloon was quiet, in a way it never was at night. The particular emptiness of a space designed for noise. When the noise is absent, the chairs upturned on the tables, the swept floor showing its actual quality for the first time. Dutch led them to his corner table and sat down and looked at them both with the appraising intelligence of a man who has survived a long time in a difficult business by reading situations accurately. "Reed came to see me yesterday," Dutch said. Cole said, "What did he want?" "He wanted the gold back," Dutch said, "on grounds that the transaction was coerced, which I told him was an interesting characterization, given that he was the one auctioning his niece in my establishment." Dutch's eyes moved to Lena. "He also said some things about your condition that I won't repeat since they appear to be considerably less accurate than he believed." Lena held his gaze. Dutch looked at her for a moment with something she hadn't expected from him: respect. The specific, earned kind. "What do you need from me?" he said. Cole laid it out plainly. The deed, the federal filing, the need for a witness to the original transaction who could speak to the legal nature of it, that it had been conducted publicly, voluntarily on Reed's part, with full payment accepted. Dutch listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I'll put it in writing, notarized." He paused. "I'll also tell you that Reed has been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office. He's filed a complaint about the transaction." The nature of the complaint. Dutch looked at Lena with the careful attention of a man choosing his words. "Is that the girl is not competent to be party to any legal transaction because she is—" He stopped. "Because she's mute," Cole said. "Because she is mute, and therefore in Reed's legal argument cannot enter into any binding arrangement on her own behalf, which he is using to argue that she remains under his guardianship regardless of who paid what to whom." The table was very quiet. Lena felt the shape of it, the elegance of it, in the terrible way that a well-laid trap is elegant. Hiram had thought of this. Not yesterday, not in response to the gold. He had thought of it before. He had been constructing this argument for years, perhaps building the case that she was incompetent, permanently damaged, legally invisible, because a woman who cannot speak, cannot testify, cannot sign documents in a contested proceeding, cannot make claims that will hold up when a man with 13 years of established local presence says otherwise. The silence had not just protected her. He had been using it to erase her. Cole said carefully, "When is the marshal expected?" "He sent a deputy," Dutch said. "Young man named Carver. He's been in town since yesterday. He's been talking to people." Dutch paused. "He talked to me this morning, in fact, before you arrived." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Dutch said, "which is that I accepted legal payment in a public transaction and the arrangement was Hiram Reed's own proposal, not anyone else's." He looked at Lena again. "I also told him that I had no personal knowledge of the girl's faculties, that I had no reason to assume she was not fully capable." Lena reached into her bag. She took out the deed still folded, still in its careful creases, and she laid it on the table in front of Dutch Pharaoh. He looked at it. He unfolded it. He read it. He looked up. "Your father's name," he said. She touched the date. Dutch sat back in his chair, and he was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man rearranging his understanding of the last 13 years. "The creek frontage," he said. "Reed's been collecting on that lease since—" She held up 10 fingers, then 3. 13 years. Dutch set the deed flat on the table. He looked at Cole, then back at Lena. "Does Reed know you have this?" She shook her head. "Does he know it exists?" She considered. Then she tilted her hand, maybe, maybe not. He must have known your father had it, Dutch said, or suspected. He tapped the table once thinking. That's why he was so thorough about your situation. Not just breaking you down, making sure anyone who might take your word for anything had a reason not to. He said it without embellishment, just factually, the way you identify the mechanism of something once you've seen the whole machine. He needed you to be the kind of person no one listens to. Cole's jaw had gone tight. She could see it from where she sat. Dutch stood up. I'll write up my statement and have it notarized at the bank before noon. Where are you going from here? Deputy Carver, Cole said. Dutch nodded. He's staying at the boarding house on Mill Street. I'd go before Reed knows you're in town. He looked at Lena one more time. You're going to have to talk to him. She picked up the deed and folded it and put it back in the bag. She stood up. Dutch watched her. I'll say this once, and I won't make a speech of it, he said. What Reed did in my saloon I allowed because men have been conducting that kind of transaction in establishments like mine since before I was born, and I told myself it was just commerce. He held her eyes. I was wrong about that, and I told the deputy so. She looked at him for a moment. Then she gave him a single nod. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. The recognition of a man who had looked at the truth of a thing and said it plainly, which was more than most managed. They went out into the cold. Cole walked beside her on the boardwalk, and she felt the town around them like a physical pressure. The eyes, the shifted conversations, the particular weight of a place that has been wrong about something for a long time and is beginning to feel it. A woman outside the dry goods store stared at her openly. Two miners coming out of the assay office stopped and watched them pass. She kept walking. Mill Street was 2 blocks east. The boarding house was a narrow 2-story building with a sign that had weathered until the letters were barely legible. Cole knocked on the front door, and a woman answered the landlady, iron-haired and suspicious, and Cole asked for Deputy Carver. And they were told to wait on the porch, which they did, and the cold settled around them while they waited, and Cole stood with his coat collar up and his eyes on the street. Reed will know we're here within the hour, he said quietly. Probably less. She knew. Whatever Carver asks you, Cole said, take your time. You don't have to answer fast. There's no law that says a person has to speak quickly. She looked at him. I'll be right here, he said. The whole time, right here. The door opened. Deputy Carver was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25, with an open, serious face and a badge that looked newer than his coat, the kind of young man who became a lawman because he actually believed in the law rather than because it offered him power. He looked at Cole and then at Lena, and his face showed something she hadn't expected either. He'd been told she was mute, and he was visibly recalibrating. Miss Carter, he said. I'm Deputy Carver out of the Helena Territorial Office. I've been sent to look into a complaint filed by Mr. Hiram Reed. He paused. I want to be straightforward with you. I haven't formed any conclusions. I'm here to gather information. He looked at Cole. And you are Cole Maddox. I was party to the transaction Reed is complaining about. Carver nodded. All right. Can we... He gestured inside. They sat in the boarding house's front room, rigid furniture, a cold fireplace, the smell of old wood and coffee. Carver had a notebook. He was the kind of man who used it. Miss Carter, he said, I need to ask you some questions directly. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to, but I want to give you the opportunity. He looked at her steadily. Can you speak? The question sat in the room. Lena felt it, the weight of it, the years of it, the thumbnail and the anchor and the armor, and every calculated silence she'd built and maintained and hidden behind. She felt Cole beside her, not touching, just present the way he was always present, like a wall that didn't push but held. She felt Hiram Reed's voice in her memory. She don't talk back. She thought about the ledger, about the space he'd left for the word he didn't have yet. She thought about we fight. She looked at Deputy Carver. Yes, she said. Her voice came out rough, not from incapacity, but from disuse. 3 years of disuse, the texture of it abraded by long silence, like a hinge that needs working before it moves freely. But it was there. It was fully, undeniably there. One syllable clear and unambiguous in that cold little room. Carver blinked. Cole did not move beside her, but she felt something change in the quality of the air around him. "Yes," she said again, stronger, working the hinge. "I can speak." Carver looked at his notebook, then at her. He was recalibrating again, and she could see him doing it in real time, the entire framework of Reed's complaint reassembling itself in the deputy's mind under a new set of conditions. Mr. Reed's complaint states that you are, his words, a mute woman of compromised mental faculty, incapable of legal self-representation under his rightful guardianship as your sole surviving family member. Carver said it carefully, not cruelly stating it for the record. "How do you respond to that?" She opened her bag. She put the deed on the table in front of him. "That's my father's deed to creek frontage land that my uncle has been collecting lease income on for 13 years without legal right," she said. Her voice was steadier now, the roughness smoothing itself out with use, like she was remembering something she'd always known and had simply stopped practicing. "My father left it to me. I can document the date of his death and the date the deed was filed. I can document that my uncle told the mining company he was the rightful owner, and I can document that he has received income on that land every year since." Carver's pen was moving. She kept going. She told him about the boarding house, about the night at 19 when she'd said no and what it had cost her. About the systematic, she used that word deliberately, the word Dutch had used, because it was accurate, systematic dismantling of her credibility over 3 years. Not because Hiram was violent, though he was. Not because he was desperate, though he was that too. But because she had been a legal obstacle to something he wanted, and he had resolved the obstacle the way men resolve things they consider inconvenient. Carver wrote for a long time. Cole sat beside her without saying a word, and she was grateful for it, not because she needed him to speak, but because she needed to know he was there, and he understood that distinction, and his presence was exactly what it needed to be, which was solid and still and entirely hers to use or not use as she saw fit. She was 15 minutes into her account when the boarding house door opened. She knew before she turned. She knew from the quality of the silence that happened, the landlady's sharp intake of breath, Carver's pen stopping, and she turned and looked at the door, and there was Hiram Reed. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him, neither of them Garrett, and he filled the doorway the way he always had, with the physical confidence of a man who had never genuinely expected consequences. He looked at Lena with the expression she remembered from the boarding house, the cold calculation, the rapid reassessment, the anger underneath it, working like something below ice. Then he heard her voice, because she hadn't stopped speaking when the door opened. She had paused one breath, and then continued, her eyes moving back to Deputy Carver, her voice even. 13 years of lease receipts, she said. The mining company will have records. They pay by bank draft, and bank drafts leave trails. Hiram's face did something complicated. Lena, he said. She did not look at him. My deputy, Hiram said, stepping into the room, his voice shifting into the version she knew well. Reasonable, almost genial, the voice of a man who is managing a situation. I see my niece has been telling you some things. I want you to understand that she has a history of episodes, of confusion. She's been isolated up on that mountain with a man who... Mr. Reed. Carver's voice was level. Please wait outside. I have a right to be present when accusations are being... Outside, Mr. Reed. Carver stood up. He was not large, but he had the authority of his position, and the specific authority of a young man who has decided to do his job correctly. This is an official proceeding, and you were not invited to participate in it. If you don't step outside, I'll ask you to step outside more formally. The 2 men with Hiram exchanged a look. Hiram looked at Lena. She met his eyes. Something moved across his face. She had no word for it, but she recognized it, the same thing she'd seen on Garrett when he looked at her across the table in the cabin. Not fear exactly. The awareness of a man who has made a long calculation and is beginning to understand that the numbers no longer add up the way he expected. He stepped outside. The door closed. Carver sat back down. "I apologize for the interruption, Miss Carter," he said. "Please continue." Cole's hand found hers under the table, not gripping, just there, solid and warm. A point of contact offered and immediately released, leaving the choice entirely to her. She kept it. She kept talking. She talked for another 30 minutes. She told Carver about the deed and where it had been and why she'd kept it hidden in a bag lining for 3 years. Not because she hadn't known what it meant, but because knowing what it meant and having any safe way to act on it were two entirely different things when you were living under the same roof as the man it indicted. She told him about the night in the Mud Hen Saloon in enough detail that Carver's pen moved faster, and she told him about the men on the ridge and the trap set at ankle height, and she told him what Dutch Pharaoh had said, and that Dutch's notarized statement would be ready before noon. Carver asked questions. They were good questions. Specific, legally oriented. The questions of a man who was building a case and knew which details were load-bearing. She answered all of them. When she stopped, Carver closed his notebook and looked at her for a moment with an expression that had evolved considerably from the one he'd worn when she walked in. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'm going to need to take custody of that deed. I'll give you a written receipt for it, and I'll file it with the Federal Land Office in Helena directly. Given what you've described, I'm also going to recommend that a formal fraud investigation be opened into Hiram Reed's collection of lease income from property he did not legally own." He paused. "This is going to take some time. Federal processes are slow," Cole said. It was the first word he'd spoken since Carver had asked who he was. "Slow," Carver agreed. "But they're thorough, and once they're in motion, they're difficult to stop." He looked at Lena. "Your uncle has already filed a complaint against you that will be dismissed as soon as the Helena office reviews it against what I'm bringing them. He filed it on the basis that you cannot speak for yourself." He said it plainly without drama. That position is no longer tenable. She felt something in her chest, not triumph. Something quieter and more specific. The feeling of a thing correctly named. She reached across the table and picked up the receipt Carver was writing out, and she read it carefully. She read everything carefully she always had. And she said, "That's correct," when he asked if she understood it, and she signed her name at the bottom in a clear, even hand. Hiram Reed was still outside when they came out. He was standing on the porch with his 2 men, and the cold had done nothing to improve his expression. He looked at Cole first. That was automatic, the instinct to look at the man, and then he looked at Lena. "Whatever you told him," Hiram said, "it won't stand. I've got 13 years of receipts from that company, and my name on every one of them, and there ain't a court in this territory." "There's a federal land office in Helena," Lena said. He stopped, not because of what she said, because she'd said it at all. She watched him absorb it, the voice, the directness, the entire recalibration of what he was dealing with that her voice required. She watched the cold confidence in his face start to crack at its edges, the way ice cracks when the temperature shifts slowly and then all at once. "You don't have any proof of—" "Deputy Carver has the deed," she said. "Signed by my father. Filed 12 years ago. Dated before you told the mining company you owned the frontage." She held his eyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not shake. "You spent 13 years making sure I couldn't say anything that anyone would take seriously. You sold me in a saloon to make sure I stayed gone." She paused. "I'm not gone." Hiram's jaw worked. One of his men shifted his weight. Cole turned his head slightly in that direction, just turned it, nothing more, and the man went still. "You've got nothing," Hiram said, but his voice had changed. The reasonableness was gone. What was under it was uglier and less controlled. "You're a woman who hasn't spoken in 3 years, and a trapper with a scar, and a grudge, and a federal deputy with a notarized statement and a deed and 30 minutes of testimony," Cole said. His voice was entirely level. "You want to add something to that list, Hiram, or are we done out here?" The porch was very quiet. Hiram looked at Lena one more time. She watched him make the calculation, the same one he'd always made, the one about what she was worth, and what she would cost, and whether she could be managed. She watched him run the numbers and arrive at a different answer than he'd expected, and she watched that land on his face like cold water. He turned and walked off the porch. His men followed. She watched him go down Mill Street until he turned the corner and disappeared. And then she stood on the porch of the boarding house in the cold Montana air, and she breathed. Cole came to stand beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. "Dutch's statement will be ready in an hour," he said. "We take it to Carver, and then—" he paused. "Then we decide what comes next." She turned to look at him. At the scar and the gray eyes and the coat he'd worn down a mountain for her, and the hands that had learned to be careful about everything that mattered. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Her voice was fully back now, not rough anymore, not abraded. Just her voice. The voice she'd had at 19, and put away and taken back out on a cold porch in Bitter Creek, while the man who'd stolen her silence walked down the street with nowhere left to go. Cole looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd written in the ledger, like something extraordinary, the word he'd almost crossed out and left. "Don't thank me," he said. "You did that." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned and walked down the porch steps toward Dutch Farrow's saloon, and Cole Maddox fell into step beside her, and the town of Bitter Creek watched them pass with the mute attention of a place that is witnessing something it will be talking about for a long time, and she felt it and did not look away from it, and did not fold herself small against it. She walked like a woman who owned land. Because she did. Dutch Farrow's notarized statement was 4 pages long. Lena read every word of it standing at the bar of the Mud Hen Saloon, while Dutch watched her read, and Cole stood at her shoulder, and the saloon's daytime quiet held itself around them like a held breath. Dutch had written it, the way he ran his card table, precisely, without sentiment, every relevant fact stated in plain language, and dated and signed in the firm hand of a man who understood that the value of a document lives in its clarity. She set the last page down. "It's accurate," she said. Dutch nodded. "I know it is. I was there." He looked at her with the same quality of attention he'd had that morning that earned specific respect. "I had it witnessed by the bank manager and the land clerk. 2 signatures besides mine. Reed will have difficulty arguing that 3 men in this town are all lying in the same direction." Cole picked up the pages and squared them. "We take this to Carver now." "There's something else," Dutch said. They both looked at him. Dutch reached under the bar and brought out a flat leather envelope, the kind used for carrying papers. He set it on the bar between them. "2 days ago, before Reed filed his complaint, and before I knew any of you were coming back down this mountain, a man came into the Mud Hen. Name of Aldridge. He works for the mining company, not locally, out of their Helena office. He was in Bitter Creek, doing what he called a routine audit of their lease agreements in this territory." Lena's hands went still on the bar. "He asked me about Reed," Dutch said. "Specifically, he asked whether I knew anything about the original land title on the creek frontage, because something in their records hadn't been sitting right with him for about 2 years, and he'd finally gotten authorization to look into it." Dutch looked at Lena. "I told him I didn't know much. At that point, I didn't." He tapped the leather envelope. "But I told him to leave me his contact information in case I came across anything relevant." Cole picked up the envelope. Inside was a card heavy stock. Helena address and name. Thomas Aldridge, Regional Land and Title Consolidated Mountain Mining Company. Lena took the card. She held it in both hands, and she felt the shape of what Dutch was telling her settle into place like the last piece of a mechanism clicking home. The mining company had already been looking, which meant this was not just Lena's fight against Hiram Reed in a small Montana town where Reed had 13 years of relationships and she had 3 years of enforced silence. This was a mining company with a Helena office and a man named Aldridge who had authorization and 2 years of unease about a lease agreement, and all of that pointed in the same direction as the deed in her bag and Dutch's 4-page statement and Deputy Carver's notebook. "Dutch," she said, "can you send a wire to Aldridge today?" Dutch looked at her steadily. Already drafted it this morning, he said. Waiting on your word. She picked up the pages and the leather envelope, and she looked at Cole. He was watching her with the expression she'd come to know best. Not proud exactly, because pride implied surprise, and he had stopped being surprised by her somewhere around the night he'd sat on the floor of the cabin and she'd put both hands flat on the table. This was something quieter and more permanent. Recognition. Send it, she said. Dutch reached under the bar for the wire draft. They were back out on the street within 20 minutes, walking toward Mill Street and Carver's boarding house, and the town watched them the way it had watched them all morning, with the particular intensity of a place whose primary story is shifting under its feet and knows it. A woman who'd been sold in the Mudhen Saloon 6 weeks ago was walking its boardwalks with a legal deed and a notarized statement, and a voice she'd apparently been keeping in reserve, and that was the kind of thing that rewrote a town's understanding of itself, whether the town wanted it rewritten or not. Lena did not look at the people watching. She looked straight ahead, and she walked, and she thought about her father, a man she had spent 10 years not letting herself think about because the grief of him was too close to the grief of everything else, and she had needed to keep her walls intact. James Carter, who had filed a deed 12 years ago and died 2 years later without knowing what that deed would become, who had left her in Hiram Reed's custody because Hiram was the only family remaining, and James Carter had not known, could not have known, the particular cold intelligence behind his brother-in-law's pleasant face. She thought, I'm finishing it, Papa. I'm finishing what you put in motion. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. Then she stopped. She let the hand open. She looked at it, the small red mark, the habitual pressure of 3 years, and she closed her fingers over it and kept walking. Carver was waiting on the boarding house porch. He had his coat on and his hat, which meant he'd been planning to go somewhere. He saw them coming, and he stayed. She gave him Dutch's statement. He read it on the porch in the cold, with the focused attention she'd already clocked as characteristic of him. He read things the way good lawmen did, looking for the architecture of it, the places where the structure held and the places where it might be tested. He looked up. This is thorough, he said. Dutch Farrow is a thorough man, Cole said. I've also contacted Thomas Aldridge at Consolidated Mountain Mining, Lena said. He's been conducting an independent audit of the creek frontage lease. He has 2 years of doubts about the legitimacy of Reed's claim and authorization from his company to investigate. She held Carver's eyes. When he arrives, whatever I've told you, and whatever Dutch has documented, will have corporate corroboration. Carver was quiet for a moment. How do you know about Aldridge? Dutch told us this morning. Aldridge came to him 2 days ago asking questions. Carver's jaw shifted, the slight movement of a man recalibrating. I wasn't aware of that. He made a note. The Helena office didn't mention an active corporate inquiry. The Helena office was responding to Reed's complaint, Cole said. Aldridge is operating out of the same city, but a different track. They may not have compared notes. Carver looked at his notebook, then at Lena. Miss Carter, I have to be honest with you about something. Reed's complaint, while it's going to be dismissed, the mechanism for dismissing it isn't immediate. There's a process. Until that process completes, your legal status with respect to your uncle's guardianship claim is technically unresolved, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. How long? Weeks, potentially. If the Helena office moves quickly on the fraud investigation, the guardianship question becomes moot. You can't legally claim guardianship over someone you're under federal investigation for defrauding. But if Reed contests the fraud filing, it could stretch into months. Cole said, and in the meantime. Carver looked at them both. In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend Miss Carter not be alone in this town. It was not a subtle statement. She appreciated it. I'm not going back to the Ridge, she said. The decision had made itself while she'd been talking clear and simple. Not yet. If I leave Bitter Creek now, Reed will use it. He'll argue I fled. He'll argue incompetence, instability, everything he's already argued. She paused. I need to stay visible. I need people in this town to see me standing here and speaking plainly and making legal decisions until the process is complete. Carver nodded slowly. That's a sound instinct. Cole said nothing. She turned to look at him. His face was working through something. She could see it, the particular tension of a man who wants to say one thing and is deciding whether it's his thing to say. "Say it," she told him. He looked at her. Then he said, "I don't want you staying alone in this town." "I know. I'll stay with you." She held his gaze. "You've got lines on the ridge. They'll wait. Cole, they'll wait," he said again simply. And that was the end of that. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come down off a mountain because she'd been standing somewhere she shouldn't have been standing, who had slept on the floor and left the trail south open and written things in a ledger he kept face down on a shelf, and she felt the word from that ledger again. Extraordinary. The word he'd almost crossed out. "All right," she said. They took a room at the boarding house, 2 rooms on different floors, the landlady's expression making abundantly clear what she thought of the arrangement without her having to commit to the position verbally. Lena unpacked her bag onto the narrow dresser, and she sat on the edge of the boarding house bed, and she looked at the room. It was not unlike the room she'd had here before. Narrow, cold, thin walls. She could hear the sound of the stamp mill through the window, the same rhythm it had always had, the mountain being processed 1 ton at a time. She was not the same person who had last sat in a room like this. She washed her face and her hands, and she went downstairs and ate dinner in the boarding house dining room, at a table where 2 other guests studiously avoided looking at her, and she ate steadily and without discomfort, and thought about what needed doing tomorrow. Cole came down late and sat across from her and ate his own dinner, and they talked. Actually talked full sentences the first time they'd had a real conversation in public, in a lit room with other people present. She noticed the way he listened, which was with his whole attention, the way he did everything. She noticed the way he said her name when he was making a point, not decoratively but functionally. The way you use a name when you want someone to hear that what you're saying is directed specifically at them and no one else. She noticed that she liked it. She noticed that she had been noticing this category of things for some time, and had been filing them under not yet with a discipline that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Not yet, she told herself again. There was work to do first. The next 3 days were the most exhausting of her life, and she had lived through some genuinely exhausting things. She went to the mining company's local office on the first morning and asked to see their lease records for the creek frontage, and the clerk, a young man named Toby, who had heard enough around town to be simultaneously nervous and curious, told her those records were internal and he couldn't release them. And she told him that Deputy Carver of the Territorial Marshal's Office had an ongoing investigation into those exact records, and she was requesting a voluntary review under that investigation before a formal subpoena made it involuntary, and Toby went to find his supervisor. The supervisor was a practical man. He let her look at the records. She sat in their back office for 4 hours with a lamp and a ledger of her own, purchased that morning from the dry goods store, and she copied 13 years of lease payments, dates, amounts, the name on the receiving account. All of it in her careful, even hand, building a document that said in numbers what the deed said in legal language, that Hiram Reed had collected income from land that did not belong to him for so long that the total, by her calculation, exceeded $4,000. $4,000. She sat back in the chair and looked at the number she'd written at the bottom of the last page, and she thought about the boarding house room, and the thin wall, and a 19-year-old girl who'd said no and paid for it with 3 years of her voice, and she felt the anger, not new anger, but the old anger, finally having somewhere to land. She picked up the pen and wrote it again. $4,214. She was closing the ledger when the office door opened, and the supervisor looked in with an expression that had gone from practical to alarmed. "Miss Carter," he said, "there's a man here. He says he's Thomas Aldridge." She stood up. Aldridge was perhaps 50, with the look of a man who had spent his career in rooms with legal documents and knew exactly what they were worth. He shook her hand with the direct grip of someone who had read Dutch's Wire and made his own calculations on the ride from Helena. "Miss Carter," he said, "I came as soon as I could." He looked at the ledger on the table, then at her. "You've been in the records." "Supervisor Hennessy gave me voluntary access under the territorial investigation." Aldridge looked at Hennessy. Hennessy nodded. "May I?" Aldridge gestured at the ledger. She pushed it across the table. He read it with the focused speed of a man for whom numbers were a primary language, moving through the pages, without stopping occasionally going back one page to check something against the previous one. He reached the last page. He looked at the total. $4,214, he said. Over 13 years, she said. The deed was filed by my father 12 years ago. The lease was already in place at that point, established under a prior arrangement that Reed, I believe, convinced my father was temporary while my father was ill. My father died before he could act on it. Aldridge set the ledger down. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man confirming something he'd suspected for 2 years. I have been looking at this lease agreement for 24 months, he said. There was something in the original title documentation that never resolved cleanly. A reference to a prior deed that should have been in our records and wasn't. Reed told our Helena office it had been lost in a fire. He paused. There was no fire. Lena said, No, there wasn't. You have the deed. Deputy Carver has it now. I gave it to him 2 days ago. Aldridge nodded slowly. I need to speak with Carver today, and I'm going to need your testimony formally recorded, not just for the territorial investigation, but for Consolidated Mountain's own legal proceedings. Because this company has been party to a fraudulent lease arrangement for 13 years, and our legal obligation is to make that right. He looked at her steadily. That means the back payments, Miss Carter. All of it. Every dollar Reed collected from us goes into an account in your name once the federal title is confirmed. The room was very quiet. $4,214. She was 22 years old. She had lived in a boarding house room with a thin wall. She had stitched a man's leg with thread from a tin box and fired a rifle through a window and walked into a saloon she'd been sold out of and said, You don't own me, with her whole voice and her whole self. She thought about the ridge, the cabin, the gray horse and the cold, and the particular silence of a place where silence meant peace instead of survival. All of it, she said. Every dollar, Aldridge said. She thought about what $4,000 built, what it changed, what it opened. She folded her hands on the table. Then let's begin, she said. The formal testimony took the better part of the afternoon. Carver and Aldridge, and a court recorder whom Aldridge had brought from Helena, sat in the boarding house's front room, and Lena talked, and she discovered something she hadn't expected, that speaking the truth in its full and accurate shape for the first time was not exhausting, but clarifying the way cleaning a long, dirty window clarifies the light. She said everything. She said it plainly and in order, and with the specific dates and amounts she'd spent 3 days compiling, and the recorder's pen moved steadily, and nobody in that room doubted a word of it. Cole sat in the corner the entire time. He didn't speak. He wasn't asked to. He was simply there the way he'd said he'd be, and she used his presence the way she'd used it from the beginning. Not as support in the sense of something holding her up, but as a fixed point, a reference the way you use a landmark when you're navigating somewhere you've never been. When it was done, Carver shook her hand. Aldridge shook her hand and said, I'll have the federal title confirmation processed within the month. Our legal team will be in contact about the restitution. She thanked them both. She walked out of the boarding house and stood on the porch in the cold late afternoon, and she breathed. Cole came out behind her and stood beside her and said nothing. She said, It's done. Most of it, he said. She looked at him. Reed still has to answer, he said. That part takes time. I know, she paused. But the part I can do, I've done it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, you have. She looked out at Bitter Creek, the stamp mill smoke, the boardwalks, the faces of a town that had watched a woman sold 6 weeks ago and was now watching something it didn't entirely have words for. She thought about what she'd been when she walked into the Mud Hen Saloon that night. Not broken, she'd never let herself be broken. Not really, even when it felt like it. But silenced. Systematically, deliberately silenced by a man who understood that a woman with no voice is a woman with no claim. She thought about all the things her silence had cost her. She thought about all the things it had taught her. And she thought about the ledger on the cabin shelf face down, and the space left for a word that didn't exist yet, and a man who had written, "We fight" in plain pencil on a blank page, and meant every letter of it. She turned to look at Cole. He was already looking at her. He'd been looking at her, she thought, in one way or another, since the night he'd walked into the Mud Hen Saloon and seen her standing somewhere she shouldn't have been standing. "I want to go home," she said. She felt the word, as she said it, home felt it land in the air between them, with all its unexpected weight, and she watched it land on Cole's face too, watched him receive it with the particular care he gave to things that mattered. "The cabin needs re-chinking before the next hard freeze," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that she recognized from the ledger, something he was managing carefully, keeping at the right temperature. "I know," she said. "I watched you mark the spots. There's about 12 feet of north wall that needs attention. I know how to pack chinking." "I figured you for it," he said. She heard the echo of that, "I figured you for it," and felt it move through her chest, the way warmth moves through cold hands slowly, and then all at once. She stepped off the porch. She stopped and looked back at him. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the gold, not for the cabin, for—" She stopped. She looked for the right word, the way he looked for things in the ledger, patiently without forcing it. "For leaving the trail south open," she said finally. "Every day, and never asking me to close it." He stood on the boarding house porch in the fading afternoon light, with his scar and his gray eyes and his heavy coat, and she watched something move across his face that she had no name for yet, and suspected she would spend a considerable amount of time learning the name of. "It's still open," he said quietly. "It'll always be open, but I'll say this once: Lena and I won't make a speech of it." He paused, choosing his words with the care he gave the ledger. "I would rather you didn't take it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word he'd almost crossed out. She thought about hands flat on a table and a fire in a stove and 12 stitches done steadily and a rifle through a window, and "we fight" written in plain pencil and meaning it. She thought about what it was to be seen accurately by another person, not idealized, not managed, not silenced, just seen the way he had seen her from the very first night, as someone still in the process of becoming. "I know," she said. She turned back toward the street. "Come on then," she said without looking back, because she knew he'd follow, not because she required it, but because he would choose to the same way she would choose it, the way two people choose things when they have looked at each other clearly and found nothing they needed to look away from. She heard his boots on the porch steps behind her. They walked back through Bitter Creek side by side, in the last of the afternoon light, and the town watched them go. Past the Mud Hen Saloon, where a pouch of raw gold had hit a bar and changed the direction of everything. Past the assay office and the dry goods store and the stamp mill with its relentless rhythm. Past all the architecture of a life that had been built around her silence and was now going to have to reckon with her voice. She did not look at any of it. She looked forward. The gray horse was waiting at the rail where they'd tied him. Cole untied the reins and checked the saddle with the same efficient care he always did, the same no-wasted motion, nothing performed quality she'd watched in him since the first morning she'd woken up in the cabin and built the fire before he did. He held the stirrup for her, and she mounted, and he swung up behind her and gathered the reins. The horse moved forward. Bitter Creek fell away behind them. The trail north climbed into the trees, and the trees opened into the ridge, and the ridge rose toward the cabin where the ledger sat on the shelf and the stove waited, and 12 feet of north wall needed chinking before the next hard freeze. The mountain rose ahead of them, cold and enormous, and entirely indifferent to any human story, except that it had held this particular one with a kind of rough, unconscious grace. Had given two people a storm and a wound, and a blizzard's worth of silence in which to find out who they actually were. She felt Cole's presence at her back, solid, warm present, and she felt the mountain air on her face, and she breathed it in, clean and sharp and real. She thought about $4,000 and what it built. She thought about a deed filed in her father's name and what it meant to claim it. She thought about the boarding house room she'd left behind and the person she'd been in it, and she thought about the woman who had walked out of that room and spoken her name plainly to a federal deputy and signed a legal document in a clear, even hand. She thought about the ledger, the space left for a word that didn't exist yet. She thought, "I'll find it. We'll find it. There's time." The trail curved, and the last light of Bitter Creek disappeared behind the ridge. Ahead, the cabin waited on the slope where the mountain had its back to the worst of the wind, small and solid, and built with the particular honesty of a man who understood that what you build in a hard place has to hold, or it doesn't hold at all. She was going home, not to a place she'd been given, or a place she'd been sold into, or a place she'd survived. Home in the only sense that had ever mattered, a place chosen deliberately with her own voice and her own hands, and her own full understanding of what she was choosing. Lena Carter was 22 years old, and she had land that was hers, and a voice she'd taken back, and a scar-faced mountain man who kept the trail south open, and would go on keeping it open because that was the kind of man he was, and she would go on not taking it because that was the kind of woman she was becoming. The mountain held them both. And the silence on the ridge was no longer armor, no longer survival, no longer the only weapon a silenced woman had left. It was just peace, honest, chosen, earned, and it was entirely irrevocably theirs.